In the early hours of the morning of May 30, 1999, a call was made to the police on the switchboard of the 110 emergency line in Beijing. The caller was a young woman who spoke in panicked but hushed tones, telling the operator there was a man with a knife in her home. As the obviously terrified woman spoke, she switched between speaking the standard Mandarin and her native Minnan dialect, often spoken in the Fujian area in the south of the country. The switchboard operator tried hard to calm the caller down. She needed her to speak Mandarin, so she could get more information about the caller's location and what was happening there. The caller managed to explain that the intruder had already attacked and hurt several of her friends in the apartment. As the switchboard operator asked for the address, there was a loud scream. This was followed by silence. The phone call went dead. Police in the switchboard room immediately began tracing the origin of the call. Then, only moments after the previous one ended, another emergency call came in. A woman returning home after finishing her night shift informed the switchboard there was a woman lying on the floor, outside the door of her building. The woman was covered in blood, seriously injured, and didn't seem to be breathing. The caller said she recognized the woman as one of her neighbors. Police close to the Hongda community in the western district of Fujian were dispatched to the scene. By the time police arrived, a crowd of residents, who had been woken by the disturbance, had gathered outside the front of the building and were being kept back by the community's security guards. As the officers approached, they were greeted with the gruesome sight of a young woman, in her early 20s, lying on the floor, her white clothing now dyed red. Behind her there was a long trail of blood that led back into the building. The officers searched in vain for any vital signs from the victim, but found none. They cautiously followed the blood trail into the building, a track of bloody footprints guiding them to the second floor. A pair of discarded, bloody slippers sat outside the open door of room 202. The experienced officers slowly moved towards the apartment, calling into the room. There was no response from the occupants. However, the unwelcome but familiar smell of blood filled the air. The officers entered the apartment and quickly called for more assistance. Strewn around the room were the bodies of 7 women. All young, all covered in blood, all with numerous knife wounds, and all dead. A full criminal investigation team arrived at the shockingly violent scene and quickly got to work on investigating what had happened and identifying the 8 young women. The apartment was around 100 square meters and was being used as a dormitory for the women. Police found a second body lying on a bed in the northern bedroom. A third body was discovered in a room that connected the apartment's lobby and the southern bedroom, slumped against a wall. It was in the doorway of that room where the 4th victim was found. Already shocked at the brutality and violence of what they had seen, what was found in the southern bedroom would stun even the most experienced investigators on the team. The bodies of 3 more young women lay dead on the bunk beds that lined the walls of the room, with a 4th victim lying on the floor between the beds. Each of the victims had multiple knife wounds and their throats slashed. As part of the investigation team got to work on searching for evidence inside the apartment, others were asking residents of the building if they'd seen or heard anything. While no one living in the building had any eyewitness accounts to pass on, many said they had been woken up by the shouts and screams from the apartment. Unfortunately, the shouting had been in a dialect of Chinese the Beijing residents couldn't understand. Most people had assumed it was just an argument that had broken out between the women and didn't want to get involved. The police went to interview the woman who found her neighbor lying dead outside the building. The woman, identified as Lian, lived in room 202, next door to the room housing the women. As she just returned home from her night shift at work, she had not seen or heard anything. She was, however, able to give police more information about the 8 victims. She told police the women had all recently arrived in Beijing together just a month prior from Fuzhou, in the province of Fujian. They had been hired by a jeweler company to work as salesgirls, and the apartment was being rented for them by the company. She didn't know the women especially well, just chatting to them when they met in the hallway of the building, but said they were always polite and friendly. As far as she was aware, there weren't any conflicts between the women and other residents of the property. With help from the caller Lian, and police finding the women's identity cards while searching the apartment, the 8 victims were quickly identified. The victims found in the southern bedroom would be identified as 24-year-old Li Meiqi, who according to the investigation was the first woman attacked. Next to her on the same bed was the body of 22-year-old Jiang Xuejin. Lying dead on a bed on the opposite side of the room was Wu Shengdan, who was one of 2 women in the apartment aged 20. The youngest victim, 17-year-old Wang Mayu, was lying on the floor between the beds. The victim outside the building, who was discovered by Lian as she arrived home from work, was 22-year-old Xiao Meifang. The body found slumped in the doorway belonged to 24-year-old Xue Zhuying. As the oldest of the girls, she was appointed by the company to be the apartment supervisor, in charge of handling any disputes or issues, and passing on messages from the company. In the adjoining room, police identified the body of the other 20-year-old woman, Xu Huijuan. The final victim was Chen Ruihua, who was 21 years old. She had been the one to first call the police, desperately asking for help, in the early hours of that morning. Once the bodies of the women had been forensically examined, it was found that they all been victims of a frenzied vicious attack. In total, there were a combined 120 injuries caused by a knife. Each woman had received between 8 and 10 wounds from their attacker. There was no evidence of any attempt to otherwise assault or violate any of the women during the attack. And despite the number of victims and injuries caused to them, other evidence found in the apartment pointed to the attack being carried out by a single individual. There were a number of bloody footprints that belonged to one person dotted around the apartment, in the lobby, and stairwell outside. They didn't match any of the victims, and they appeared to have been left by a man who hadn't been wearing shoes. The neighbor Lian didn't live alone, and the apartment wasn't empty while the attack took place. Both her husband and 5-year-old child were home at the time. In fact, Lian had mentioned to police that she noticed the lights were on in the apartment when she found the body of Xiao Meifang. Unusual for 4 o'clock in the morning. Both Lian and the police naturally assumed that her husband had been woken by the noise from the neighboring apartment, as other residents of the building had. However, when police talked to the husband Zhao Lianrong, he immediately fell under suspicion. He claimed that he hadn't heard any noises from the apartment next door as he was asleep at the time. This was despite people on other floors in the building being woken by the disturbance. Investigators also noted that he seemed nervous and twitchy as he spoke to them, having difficulty controlling his legs from shaking as he answered questions. He also had a towel wrapped round his hand. His wife Lian had noticed it on entering their home. He claimed to her and the police that he had injured himself at work and it was just a minor cut. After speaking to him, the police now considered Zhao Lianrong as their #1 suspect. They couldn't understand how he seemed to be the only resident of the building who didn't hear anything, despite being closest to the room. His flustered and nervous demeanor, and the injury to his hand only furthered their belief that he had taken the lives of his 8 next-door neighbors. However, the Beijing police didn't want to act without having more than just suspicions. They wanted some solid evidence that could link Zhao Lianrong to the crime scene. They decided to look into his background while forensic investigators worked on collecting evidence. A native of Beijing, and growing up in the district of Shijingshan, Zhao Lianrong was 37 years old and had no criminal record. He was working in a low-level position in a machine tool factory, a job he only got because his father had worked there for many years, and asked the management to offer his son a position. However, neither the manager of the factory nor colleagues had much positive to say about Zhao Lianrong. In fact, as police looked into his history more, they were surprised he was still employed there. He was seen as an unreliable worker, often late and leaving before his shift had ended. He also had issues with the director of the workshop, who was a retired soldier, after he admonished Zhao Lianrong for his poor attitude to the job. The workshop director was from the province of Hebei, which despite surrounding Beijing, made him an outsider in the eyes of Zhao Lianrong. He resented an outsider being in a higher position than a native Beijinger, and being disciplined by someone like that. Angered and insulted, he wanted to retaliate, but didn't have the courage to do it directly. So, he decided to feed the man's dog some meat buns he tainted with rat poison. When the workshop director found his dog dead, he went looking for answers. Unfortunately for Zhao Lianrong, a janitor at the factory had seen him feeding the dog the poisoned meat buns, and told the workshop director. It took the father of Zhao Lianrong, himself a military veteran, begging the workshop director to give his son a second chance to save his job. Furious at the janitor for informing on him, Zhao Lianrong wanted revenge. The janitor had a pet bird, which was found dead after it too was poisoned by Zhao Lianrong. He had sprayed the bird with insecticide, leaving it dead in the bottom of its cage. This time there were no witnesses to his actions, so nothing was done about it, despite people's suspicions. Killing 2 beloved pets wasn't enough. He took his anger out on the workshop director and janitor in a bizarre manner. Stealing both men's identity cards and the director's car license plate, Zhao Lianrong defecated on the items in the factory's communication room. Once again there were no witnesses. With no way to prove who the pile of excrement belonged to, Surveillance cameras were set up in the room, in case it happened again. Thinking he had gotten away with it, Zhao Lianrong repeated the action, this time being caught on camera. Amazingly, he still managed to keep his job, thanks to both his father and his wife, pleading with the workshop director to show some mercy. Once again, Zhao Lianrong somehow was allowed to remain employed. While the incidents were unusual and troubling, they didn't indicate much to suggest Zhao Lianrong was capable of the violence the police were now investigating. The police in Beijing were one of the few forces that were capable of DNA analysis at that time in China, and as they waited for the forensic reports, they attempted to find other evidence. They first conducted experiments to see if the claim Zhao Lianrong made, that he didn't hear anything, held any water. The building had poor soundproofing, and noises carried throughout the apartments quite easily. It seemed extremely unlikely that he was unaware of the noise coming from the apartment next door. They also asked Zhao Lianrong for a footprint sample. The prints found in the apartment appeared to come from someone who walked around the rooms in socks. Zhao Lianrong agreed to the request. However, investigators noticed that he was trying to avoid giving a clear print by attempting to push himself up on his toes. When analyzing the footprints recovered from the room, it was discovered that the person the footprints belonged to had index toes which were longer than their big toes. Despite his attempts to disguise his footprints, it was still clear that the index toes on the feet of Zhao Lianrong were longer than his big toes, and they matched the prints found at the scene. Police arrested Zhao Lianrong based on the footprint evidence. Once in custody, they took a blood sample to compare it against blood found in the neighboring apartment that didn't belong to any of the young women whose lives had been ended. The sample matched with the blood taken from Zhao Lianrong. The police had their man but now wanted a confession, and to know why he committed such a brutal and violent crime. Early on in the investigation, it was assumed that it was a simple robbery gone very wrong. However, the police search of the apartment found around 30,000 RMB in cash, which for the time was a very significant amount of money. The women also each had a cell phone, which was rare in China in the 1990s, usually only available to the wealthy. The cash in phones would have been a pretty good haul for a thief. However, the items remained untouched. There was no evidence of any attempts to assault or violate any of the women, so there didn't seem to be any perverted element to the attack. Furthermore, there had been no conflicts between the women and any of their neighbors. The crime seemed to be completely without motive. At first, Zhao Lianrong gave the police little, but as he came to realize there was no way out of the situation, he would open up more. He confessed that, as his wife got to know the women from Fujian, he was angered at the fact these outsiders were earning more money than a native Beijinger like himself. Similar to his attitude towards his boss from Hebei province, he resented outsiders doing better financially than he was. He claimed his intention was just to rob the women of whatever he could find of value in the room. He went out and bought a knife and gloves in preparation. The women's apartment had a balcony that led into the southern bedroom. Zhao Lianrong noticed that the windows on the balcony were often left open and chose this as his point of entry. In the early hours of May 30th, with his wife at work and child at home sleeping, he climbed up onto the balcony and entered the bedroom. He decided not to wear shoes as so not to leave shoe prints, and his steps made less sound. As he entered the room, Li Meiqi stirred from the movement. Half asleep and unable to see clearly in the dark, she asked who was moving around at that time in the morning. Before she even knew what was happening, Zhao Lianrong attacked, injuring her several times with his knife. The noises from the attack woke the other women in the room. Without the lights on, none of them could see what had just happened clearly. Before she had any time to react, Zhao Lianrong next went for Jiang Xuejin, stabbing her multiple times in the chest. The third victim, Wu Shengdan, terrified and confused, still managed to get up and make a break for the door. She was pulled back, thrown onto a bed, and had her life brutally cut short. 17-year-old Wang Mayu was frozen in terror by the attack taking place. She tried to hide in a corner of the room, with only a towel for protection. She was spotted by Zhao Lianrong, who pulled her into the middle of the room by her hair, before attacking her with the knife. By now the other women in the apartment had been woken by the screams. The senior girl, Xu Zhuying, came to the room to see what was happening. She was injured by Zhao Lianrong as soon as she opened the door. Her survival instinct kicked in and she slammed the door shut in her attacker's face, and tried to get back to her bedroom. Kicking his way through the door, Zhao Lianrong chased the injured woman down and finished her off with his knife. Unfortunately, Xu Zhuying had led Zhao Lianrong to the remaining women. He claimed the life of Xu Huijuan, As he was attacking her friend, Xiao Meifang took an opportunity and pushed past the knife man and ran out of the room. She wasn't quite fast enough to get away. Zhao Lianrong caught up with her at the front door of the apartment. She received a knife wound to her back, however she got up, lost her slippers and tried to escape the building barefoot. Outside the door of the building, Zhao Lianrong caught her and attacked her again, this time to the neck, ending her life. This left Chen Ruihua, while Zhao Lianrong was outside with Xiao Meifang and too scared to try and leave the apartment, as the only way out would put her in the path of the home intruder. She called the police, in the vain hope they could get there in time to save her life. It was far too late. Zhao Lianrong was back in the apartment, and it didn't take him long to find her and end her life. With the last of the women cut down, Zhao Lianrong wasn't finished. Knowing the women that had time to get a look at him would have recognized him, he went back to each of the victims and made sure they didn't survive by cutting each of their throats. It was doing this when the knife slipped in his hand, and he cut himself on the blade, dripping his own blood at the crime scene. In under 20 minutes he'd taken the lives of 8 young women. He didn't make much attempt to search the apartment for anything to steal. He left the room before the police arrived. He then went back home and changed out of his blood-stained clothes, hiding them under his bed. Before he had the chance to take off his blood-stained socks, his wife Lian came home and told him what she'd found outside. He feigned ignorance to the whole thing, and when she noticed he had an injury to his hand, he told her he just cut himself at work. In the days after the incident, while police were waiting for the results of the forensic evidence from the crime scene, Zhao Lianrong cut up the socks and disposed of them, along with the knife in a drain in the community garden. It didn't take long for the police to find them. The blood of the victims still on the items. Despite Zhao Lianrong suggesting his motive was robbery, the police weren't convinced. They didn't believe that, if he just wanted to steal, he'd break into the apartment when he knew the women were home. He was their neighbor, and saw them often over the course of the month the women lived there. He would have known when they were home and when they weren't. It would have been much easier for him to break in when they were out, if he genuinely just wanted to rob them. Entering the apartment while the 8 women were home guaranteed he would have been discovered. And he knew that some of the women would have been able to identify him easily. Furthermore, going into the apartment while it was occupied meant he had to search for the valuables in the dark. If his intent was robbery, he would have required a flashlight to assist his search, something he didn't have when he went into the apartment. While there was a very respectable amount of cash in the room, and several valuable cell phones, the victims didn't do much to hide them. Police saw no evidence that Zhao Lianrong made any attempt to look for anything to take. Several handbags containing money and phones remained untouched. The police were convinced Zhao Lianrong entered the apartment that night with the sole purpose of committing intentional homicide. They wanted to know why he decided to extinguish the lives of 8 young women. However, Zhao Lianrong never changed his story, continuing to claim he only intended to burglarize the apartment, and the deaths of the women was just a consequence of that. Given the severity of the crime, the clear evidence and the confession, Zhao Lianrong faced a fast-track trial. He was found guilty of the intentional homicide of the 8 young women and was handed a death sentence by the court. A little over a month after he was arrested, on the 21st of July 1999, Zhao Lianrong was executed by gunshot to the head. However, his death left the question of what caused him to commit such a shocking, brutal, violent crime without a satisfying answer. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a like, leaving a comment, and subscribing to the channel. And hope to see you again for the next dark tale from the Middle Kingdom.